And now it's like a really special honor for me to introduce our keynote speaker, Dick Clarke. Dick, I've followed your career in the White House, ABC News commentator. I see you regularly. It's a real pleasure, just personally, to welcome you here. It's really my privilege. Richard served in the White House with President Reagan, for both George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush, for President Clinton, who appointed him as National Coordinator for Security, Infrastructure Protection, and Counterterrorism. He's taught at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. He's an on-air commentator on ABC News, which is where most of us get the opportunity to see you. And he's also chairman and CEO of Good Harbor Security Risk Management. By the way, if you're on the management side of this community we have, highly recommend that you read a recent paper that Good Harbor published on how do you talk to boards about security. It's I think, kind of the next layer of where this whole community is going. I'm seeing a lot of that in the work we're doing, the people we're meeting, and a wonderful paper, really well done on that. He's also an author, the author of the national bestsellers, Your Government Failed You, Breaking the Cycle of National Security Disasters and Cyber War, The Next Threat to National Security and What to Do About It. You saw the picture of the current book, The Sting of the Drone. As David said, he's listening to it, he loves it, and I'm looking forward to doing the same thing. You'll also be able to obtain the book this morning after the keynote, because Richard's graciously giving up his time where he'll be signing copies of the book. So I urge you to reach out there and get that. Richard, it's with great pleasure that I welcome you to ISSA LA. Thank you for being our keynote speaker.
Thanks for that gracious introduction. You did leave a few things out. My service in the Lincoln and Grant administrations. Hey, I hear there's a cybersecurity problem. Have you heard that?
Sure.
People come up to me, call me, and say, hey, I hear there's a cybersecurity problem. And you may know something about it. Does this happen to you? Yeah, there probably is. They said, well, we heard about Target, and we heard about NSA, and you did something about NSA. And tell us about that cybersecurity problem. When I first started getting these questions, what the heck does NSA have in common with Target? As you may know, I was one of the Five Guys, not the hamburger chain, but the Five Guys that President Obama asked to come in and do a little intelligence security review for him after the Snowden revelations. And so I know something about what happened at NSA. And I've looked into what happened at Target, and you know, there actually are some similarities. There are some things in common. Think about it. NSA is a big government organization. Thanks to Mr. Snowden, you know how big, about $10 billion a year. Target, very, very big retail store. They both spend a lot of money on IT. So they're both big organizations in their business. NSA is probably the biggest in its business in the world. Both spend a lot of money on IT. They both kind of thought they had secure systems. And yet they both, in one way or another, they both got hacked. And they both, as a result of those hacks, suffered enormous damage. Enormous damage. I don't know if you can put a dollar figure on the damage from NSA, but let me tell you, if you're trying to sell Cisco routers or Juniper routers or switches in Europe, if you're trying to sell cloud services in Europe and you're an American company, it's rough going now because everybody in Europe thinks that the American products have backdoors in them. And so they buy Chinese products, which are clearly more secure. Target had a quarter-over-quarter, one year to another, same quarter, loss of 46% of its revenue. 46%. And the CIO was fired, now the CEO is fired. It's probably going to be several $100 million worth of losses that Target will suffer by the time all the lawsuits are over. So they have that in common. They also have in common the fact that they were reliant on insecure vendors or insecure supply chains. For NSA, it was outsourcing a little function, just an unimportant little function, systems administrator, to Booz Allen, and to somebody who had not gone through all of the clearance requirements that an NSA employee would have gone through. And for Target, it was outsourcing the control of their chillers, their refrigerators at their stores to a company called Fazio, which needed online access for diagnostic purposes. And therefore, they let them have online access right through the firewall. Not a good idea. Because as much money as Target had spent on IT security, Fazio probably hadn't. And if you could get into Fazio, you could get in to Target. Because like NSA, Target had this assumption that if you were inside the network, well, you belonged there. You know, we'll keep the bad guys out of the network with firewalls, and antivirus, And then if somebody gets on the network, well, they're authorized. You know, they can run around, they can look at what they want to look at, they can download 1.7 million top secret code for documents. Both Target and NSA, although they would never admit it, prior to the incidents or after the incidents, both of them had, in effect, a perimeter mentality. And once you were in, you could do a lot of damage. You could run around the network, and there was not a lot to see that or a lot to stop that. And neither Target nor NSA had a breach plan. Neither one of them was really ready for when the excrement hit the fan. Now, there was a lot of excrement hitting the fan. Neither one of them was prepared to handle that. And that makes the problem 10 times worse. So, they did have things in common. And moreover, if you look at most government agencies, because for President Obama's review group, we looked at the other intelligence agencies. And we found pretty much the same state of affairs. If you look at most companies around the country, as I do, I go around the country trying to help companies figure out what to do, they all are pretty much in the same situation, where they've got some old-fashioned perimeter defense mentality, even though they don't think they do. They don't have a breach plan. They haven't figured out, if they have a breach plan, they haven't tested it. They haven't figured out what the worst-case scenario is or what their crown jewels are. They're unprepared. And so when people ask me, what's this cybersecurity problem thing that you know about? I think, why is it that I've been talking about this since 1997? Why is it that President Clinton had a national strategy to secure cyberspace? President George W. Bush had a national strategy to secure cyberspace. One of the only things he ever did right, in my view. But then I'm part of the story. Why is it, after all these years, that people still don't get it? And I wonder about it. I look at other problems. You know, when there are other problems, say healthcare. Healthcare is a big problem. Healthcare is a problem that the president cared enough about to risk his presidency. There are problems like that where the professionals in the field, the doctors in this case, people who run hospitals, go to the government, they go to the media, they go to everybody they know, and they say, there is a crisis and we are the experts. And you ought to start listening to us. Or if you don't, we have no responsibility for what happens. Why don't we do that? Why don't we, as IT security professionals, IT security specialists, stop taking it? Stop working for government agencies that don't do the right thing to secure our country. Stop working for CEOs and boards and companies that aren't doing enough to secure their data. Why don't we collectively get together and decide what our demands are? No, think about it. Remember Martin Luther during the Reformation? The Reformation started in a way when Martin Luther typed out his 99 demands. Typed is probably the wrong word. Probably scrawled his 99 demands and took them in, took a hammer and nail and stuck them on the door of the cathedral. Why do we do that? Why don't we, as IT security professionals, get together and figure out some simple demands that even our bosses can figure out, that even the Congress could understand? And then say to them, if you don't do these things, folks, don't expect us to clean up the mess. Don't expect us to be able to secure your corporate network. Don't expect us to be able to secure your government network. Don't expect the country to be able to defend itself against cyber attack if you don't do these things. It's worth a try. Nothing else has worked. Having cybersecurity strategies hasn't worked. Trying to get the Congress to pass cybersecurity legislation hasn't worked. The only thing that Congress has passed lately are pieces of legislation naming post offices after themselves. No, that's true. The majority of bills that have gone through the Congress this year are bills that rename post offices. So, began thinking, if we were going to do a list of demands and go up to the Congress, every congressman's door and nail it on their door, or go up to every CEO's suite and nail it on their suite door, what might those demands be? I don't have a good list. I have a list. And I'll go through it with you. But I want you to think about it too. I want you to think about what should that relatively short list, because these people had ADD, relatively short list be. So let me run through my list and tell me what you think. Some of these are for companies and some of these are for government. Let's start with the government. And by the way, there will be 12 demands on this list. It's nice and short. First demand of the government: start training IT security people. Start having, at the community colleges throughout our country, 2-year programs funded with qualified, certified people training them, with money for students who needed to go to those courses. Let's start increasing the number of IT security professionals. That would make us very different. You know, doctors always try to make sure there are no more medical schools. And lawyers try to make sure there are no new law schools, because they don't want to increase the supply of competition. We, on the other hand, believe, I think, that we need many more of us. We need many more people who can defend companies and can defend government agencies, who are trained and certified. So demand number 1 for the government: train more of us, and train them not only at the college level, but at the community college level, and pay their scholarships if that's necessary. We have a very small program to do that now that I helped to start 15 years ago. Let's blow it up. Let's make it much, much bigger. Second demand of government: when you're buying a product from a company, government contractor. And that's probably 80% of the companies in the United States are selling to the federal government. Or when you are regulating a critical infrastructure company, how about we demand that those companies have CISOs, certified CISOs? You're looking at me like, well, of course they do. No, they don't. Did Target? No. Somebody said when Target happened, well, they're going to fire the CISO. They didn't have one to fire. Most companies don't. So let's demand that companies do that. Number three, let's have the government demand that the ISPs do their job. The ISPs, the backbone carriers, the vendors of the internet, people who bring it to our doors, they could stop an awful lot of what's going on. But they don't. They ship it on. And in some cases, they actually make money by shipping it on. DDoS attacks actually make money for some of the ISPs. Huge volume of data coming down the line. Why don't we require ISPs to do everything that the technology allows to stop DDoS attacks and to identify and kill malware before it gets to its destination? They can do it. When you ask them now, you ask AT&T, you ask Verizon, why don't you do it? A question that the major banks in the United States asked after they all got hit by an Iranian DDoS. The answer was, well, gee, our lawyers tell us that that's a problem. We could get sued. Fine. Give them safe harbor. Give them legislation that allows them to kill malware and be safe from suit. The ISPs could get rid of 80% of the traffic that we know of as DDoS or malware. Number four, we should demand that the government stop messing around with encryption. We rely on encryption to make things work securely and safely. We can't have the government putting backdoors in encryption. We can't have the government coming up with standards for encryption that allow the government to break it. The government's job is to secure our networks, to secure our nation, not to make it more vulnerable. So let's demand that the government stay out of the business of messing with our encryption standards. And on a similar note, number six, let's demand that the government stop buying 0 days and not telling us about them. The government has created a black market in 0 days, paying people, paying companies to generate exploits and give them to you. You think if the government knows about those exploits, a responsible way that allows us to patch it quickly, to work with a software vendor, and to come up with that patch and get it out. And not to say, oh, gee, here's a possible 0 day, let me go use this to attack somebody. The first job of government is to defend, not to attack. And right now, we are so vulnerable to attacks. Our critical infrastructure is so vulnerable to attacks that when we learn about a vulnerability, our first reaction should be to fix it. That's the role of government. Number six, why don't we have Cyber Command, the new military command, works with NSA, why don't we have Cyber Command defend the United States? That's a novel idea. Not just defend DoD. Today, Cyber Command is authorized by law, by the President, only to defend DoD. And so when Cyber Command sees an attack coming on the electric power grid, on a bank, on your company, they watch it go by. Why instead are they not authorized to stop that attack and to go back and attack the attacker? I talked about that Iranian DDoS. The Iranians went after the 8 major banks in the United States with a level of DDoS that was 10 times higher than anything we had ever seen before. And they knocked offline the online banking services of Bank of America, Citibank, and the 8 next largest banks. And the US government watched it go by. That's crazy. We've built Cyber Command. It has the capability to defend all of the United States, not just DoD. Let's authorize it, let's unleash it to defend our critical infrastructure. Finance, electric power, the whole 9 yards. Number 7, let's stop allowing countries to be cyber sanctuaries. We know today that if your company is attacked, money is stolen, that money is probably moved through a series of hops to someplace in Eastern Europe or the former Soviet Union. We know when intellectual property and R&D information is stolen, it usually ends up in 1 of 2 places, either China or Russia. What happens when the FBI, you call the FBI, or you call Secret Service, which has concurrent jurisdiction, you call them in, they do the investigation, they get warrants, they trace the attack back, and it ends up in Moldova. It ends up in Ukraine. It ends up in Belarus or Romania. What happens? The answer is nothing happens. Because when the United States government goes to those governments and asks them for help, asks them to arrest somebody, 99% of the time, 99% of the time, they don't. Wonder why? Could it be that they're on the take? Could it be that the police in Romania are actually maybe in on it? Cybercrime pays because almost nobody gets arrested for cybercrime. Because most of the major cybercrime that occurs from cyber sanctuary countries. And what do we do about it? Well, in many cases, we continue to give them aid. Economic aid, trade benefits, all sorts of goodies. Why don't we start saying to those cyber sanctuary countries, unless you stop this, unless you stop crime coming into our country from your country, there will be consequences. And there's a whole long list of consequences there could be. Those, I think, are a reasonable starting point for demands on the government. 7 things we could demand of the government. What about companies? What should we demand of the CEOs and the boards of the companies that we work for and rely on and do business with? How about first, we demand you have a CISO. It's a good starting point. And that CISO be certified. That maybe you, Mr. CEO, should meet with that person quarterly. That would be a good start. There's one very large IT firm up in Silicon Valley. When I was in the White House, I went around to all of these large companies and asked to meet with the CEO. I went to this one gigantic software company up there, and the CEO, a famous name I can't use, famous name guy came to the meeting, and so did his CISO. It was a good meeting. After the meeting, he left, and the CISO said to me, "Thank you for coming. I've never met him before." No, he was out sailing. So maybe we should demand of companies that there is a CIO, that the CISO brief the CEO quarterly and brief the board maybe semi-annually And maybe we should demand that that CISO not report directly to the CIO. You guys get it. Nobody else does. No board of directors does, no CEO does. When I suggest to them, you know, the CISO can't be reporting to the CIO or this will never work, it takes like a half an hour to explain our thought. I'm not going to do that, you got it. Second demand of companies, that they share. Why don't we demand of companies that they share attack information through the information sharing and analysis centers, the ISSAs, or however you want to arrange it, share attack information anonymously, if they have to. And if they won't do it, let's require them to do it. Now, the SEC has now said, if you're a publicly traded company, the SEC is demanding now that if you're breached, you publicly notify. Well, how about we extend that and say, if there's an attack, if there's a vulnerability, if you find an IP address, a URL, if you find malware, that you are required to share that information. And then we have mechanisms that can provide anonymity and provide that information to everybody who needs it right away. And beyond sharing vulnerability and attack information, how about we share information on vendors and supply chains? We all need now to go out, especially after Heartbleed, we realize that we're all relying on software that's not necessarily secure. We all need now to think about, like Target, like NSA, about the security of our supply chains and our vendors. It's more than any one company can do to check out all of its supply chain, to check out all of its vendors, to check out all of its software. How about we demand of companies that they share information in some systematic way and pool information about that as well? What if we demand of companies that they do more than just rest on their laurels because they had a big audit firm come in and give them a gold star? Every time I'm asked to come into a company after it's been hacked, the CEO pulls me aside and says, I don't know how this happened. We were audited. How about we as security professionals tell them that having an audit or having a pen test does not make you secure? And what if we ask the companies to go beyond the perimeter security mentality? I said NSA had it, I said Target had it, most companies do. But if you ask the CIO in most companies, they'll say, oh, no, we don't have a perimeter. We don't have a perimeter defense mentality. That's very 1990s. Okay? Now you ask them, show me your IT security budget. How much of your IT security spend goes for firewalls at the perimeter, antivirus systems at the perimeter, intrusion detection systems at the perimeter? In most cases, it's over 80% of the IT security spend. They don't have a perimeter security mentality, but they're spending 80% of their money on IT security at the perimeter. Why don't we demand of them that they fund new ways of securing that admit the obvious? Even Symantec said it the other day. Antivirus is dead. Actually, Symantec said that the other day. Why don't we admit the obvious that, as the Attorney General of the United States said, Eric Holder, there are only two kinds of companies. Those that have been attacked and know it, and those that have been attacked and don't know it. The Attorney General of the United States telling us every company in the United States has been hacked. Let's tell that to the CEOs, tell that to the board members, that every company is going to be hacked. You have to deal with it that way. Deal with it by accepting the fact that the bad guys are going to get in. They're going to get through the perimeter. And if all you're doing is spending money on the perimeter, you're in trouble. And finally, going back to the Congress, maybe we could demand of companies, particularly companies that are members of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, that they tell the Chamber of Commerce to stop blocking cybersecurity legislation. I go to companies and find the CEOs and say, are you a member of the Chamber of Commerce, U.S. Chamber of Commerce? Oh yeah, great organization. By the way, do you think we should have cybersecurity legislation to do some of the things I just talked about? Oh yeah, absolutely. That's what Congress should be working on. Do you know that the organization you're a member of, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, is the reason that there's no cybersecurity legislation? That their lobbyists are all over Capitol Hill every time there's a bill that looks like it might pass, trying to prevent cybersecurity legislation? So maybe one of the demands of companies is to stop the Chamber of Commerce and other lobbyists from blocking legislation to do the things that we have to do. So that's my list of demands. I know you can make it better. But we have to start working on it. We have to start coming up with some declaration that all of us can sign up to, that we can then go to the President with, and go to the Congress with, and go to CEOs and boards of directors with, and say, look, you're right. Remember that question? Is there some sort of cybersecurity problem? Tell me about that. We need to be able to go to all those people and say, yeah, you're right. There is a cybersecurity problem. And we know how to fix it. Stop listening to other people and start listening to your IT security professionals, because we can tell you some of the things that you need to do as a company, and some of the things that we need to do together as a country to address this problem. We're not going to make the problem go away. It is a continuous improvement cycle problem, but we can make it better. We can make it better that minimizes the loss of intellectual property and R&D information to our economic competitors like China. We can make it better that minimizes the hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars that are going overseas every year to cyber criminals. And we can make it harder for countries like Iran, China, Russia, to, in some future conflict, destroy our electric power grid, blow up our pipelines, derail our trains, and bring us back to a primitive economy. But if you don't do these things, if you don't do these things that we're telling you to do, you are running the risk. And it's on you, not us. When the disasters happen, don't complain about the IT security professionals. Don't complain about the cybersecurity industry. Because we warned you. And you didn't listen. That's the message we all have to give as a group. And it's the message we all have to give every day as individuals. So that's my request to you this morning. Thank you very much.
Without knowing that I used the word inspired in my opening remarks, and you truly did. May I thank you so much for that. And may I open it up to some questions for, yeah, go ahead. We got microphones that are set up around the room if you want to come up to a mic. Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm Larry Taylor. I represent this group of, I guess, ignorant corporate governance people. I serve on the board of the National Association of Corporate Directors. About that. A question. You said that the audience gets it. The CISO should not report to the CIO. I don't get that.
Okay.
Thank you for asking.
By the way, the National Association of Corporate Directors is doing a good job starting to educate corporate directors. I'm glad to see that happen. The CIO in almost every organization has as her responsibility keeping the network up and running. Has as her responsibility making it easy for everybody in the company to do whatever they want to do. And it is not, in most companies, the case that the CIO pays attention to security. The security issue is not a matter of uptime, and it's not a matter of convenience. It's a matter of risk management. And so in companies that are members of the NACD, like American Express, Rockwell International, Time Warner Cable, more and more companies, Fortune 500 companies, are shifting their reporting lines so the CISO reports to the Chief Risk Officer. Because the CISO is a risk officer. She has some of the risk, not all of the risk, but she has responsibility for some of the risk. It's not her responsibility to keep the thing up and running with ease of use. It's her responsibility to protect the system. And that's a risk calculus. This is not a matter of yes or no. It's a matter of a spectrum of risk. And there are basically three kinds of risks that companies have to identify, first identify, and secondly deal with. Those risks that they can tolerate, because stuff happens. Those risks which they would rather not happen and they're willing to spend a little bit of money on to mitigate. And those risks which they cannot allow to happen. The Chief Risk Officer has to figure out what those risks are. And it's different for every company. Every company has a different risk tolerance. And the CISO is part of a whole of companies experience to identify those risks and then put them in those three buckets of what can I accept, what do I want to mitigate, and what can I not have happen. That's not the job of the CIO. And CIOs typically are not trained to do it. So it's fine to have the CIO involved in the discussion, but to have the CIO telling the person in charge of IT security, no, that doesn't cut it.
My name is John Aaron. I'm a certificate student at UCLA Extension. Regarding Russia, its reputation as a haven, and the notion of imposing sanctions on them regarding their incursion into the Ukraine. My question is, does the President, on his own authority, have the right or the ability to implement certain procedures such as you've been advocating without having to wait for legislation? And if he does have it, is it?
The President has a lot of authority without the Congress. The President has the authority under the Intelligence Act to commit something called covert action. The President has the authority to say, I hereby certify in a classified document that fill in the blank X is a threat to the national security of the United States. And therefore I authorize the CIA or the NSA or whoever it is to take action against them. The President could do that today against cyber criminals. The President could today say cyber criminal cartel in Romania, in Moldova, wherever, is a threat to the economic security and national security of the United States, and I authorize whatever agency to take it out. He can do that today.
Thank you.
By the way, if he does that, you know, they're going to do something back.
Two questions, if I may. One is, you mentioned having a certified or qualified CISO. What is that? We don't have any qualifying or certifying body at this point in time. And two, cyber security is a very changing world because of the changing threat. how does legislation, provide the guidance that can deal with that changing threat?
So let me answer the second one first. How does legislation deal with the changing threat? Legislation should not tell us how to architect our networks. Right? What legislation can do is require some of the things that I suggested. It can increase spending for IT security training. It can demand that ISPs kill malware. A lot of the things I suggested require legislation. Now, as to how do we certify CISOs, there ought to be a universally accepted certification of CISOs, just as there is of lawyers, doctors, and auditors. We can build on the CISSP, but there ought to be one certification that everybody accepts, and you should not be in a job like that unless you have that certification. And just as companies wouldn't think of not having general counsel, companies shouldn't think of not having a certified CISO. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Last question.
Last question. Yeah.
I have an odd little question by way of the list, but my odd little question is I'm a software developer and I have many clients, and I've observed over the years that many of my clients don't know where their jewels are.
Right.
So I have, for instance, software on somebody's desk. Is that been your experience with CIOs, that they don't have any idea where their jewels are?
So what I do with companies that I consult with is I come in, I do a discovery process to figure out where the crown jewels are. And I'll typically get one set of answers from the CEO and a very different set of answers from the guy on the loading dock with the forklift. And they're both right. But you just have to do a discovery process. I started this in government. We went around to every cabinet agency and asked them what their crown jewels were. We started with the Commerce Department because I thought that would be easy because I didn't think they had any. And we asked the Secretary of Commerce at the time, and he said, I don't know. Which kind of confirmed my suspicion. But then we started wandering around the Commerce Department, and it turns out they had a few little things that they ran, like the atomic clock, and the Hurricane Warning Center, and the Tsunami Warning Center. But there were a few things that were probably national crown jewels that the Department of Commerce had. So you're right. People don't typically know. No one in an organization will know everything. That's why you need this whole of company, a whole of organization approach to identify what the crown jewels are.
I just want to iterate, there is a sister organization that we belong to, ISSA, that has a Certified Information Security Manager program, and it is a global organization as ISSA is, and they have other certifications, and they just started, just last week, a cybersecurity nexus position or site on their website, and they're actually training entry-level security professionals, and they're starting at EuroCax and the security conference in September in Las Vegas, and they're going to have programs to teach entry-level security professionals.
That is exactly what we need, and what we need is for state governments and federal governments to say, just as they do for lawyers and auditors and doctors, you have to have that kind of certification in order to do this stuff. Thank you very much.
That was fabulous. As I said, talk about inspiring. We have an agenda for the next several years. It's almost like going to your window and opening it, leaning outside and saying, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take this anymore. This is what we got to do.